Good afternoon. On Sunday, Lee Croning and I went to Iowa for the annual gathering of our National Church Association, LCMC, which stands for Lutheran Congregations in Mission for Christ. We had a great time. The gathering is always like a great worship service and Bible study combined with a family reunion and pep rally. Many of the sessions were streamed live, and you can still watch all of that video at lcmc.net/live. Check it out. This week in our um, One Year Chronological Bible readings, we started the New Testament, started by reading through parts of the four Gospels. The word gospel means good news, specifically about Jesus and the kingdom of God. So the gospel was a message long before it was a book. And we have four different perspectives from Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Um, each one of the authors had different things that they wanted to emphasize. And so some of the stories are quite similar. Some of them are even shared word for word. But then there's some differences and some other stories and teachings that each of them present that aren't in the others. The book of Matthew is one of the earliest accounts of Jesus. While the book itself doesn't name the author, the earliest reliable tradition links it to Matthew the tax collector, one of Jesus's 12 apostles. For about 30 to 40 years, the apostles taught and verbally passed on their eyewitness accounts of Jesus, along with his teachings that they had memorized. Matthew collected and arranged all those into an amazing tapestry and designed his account to highlight certain themes about Jesus. He wanted to show how Jesus is the continuation and fulfillment of the whole biblical story of God and Israel. So he emphasized that Jesus is the Messiah from the line of David. Jesus is a new authoritative leader and teacher like Moses. And Jesus is God with us, or in Hebrew, Emmanuel. The book of Matthew is perhaps put first in the New Testament because his gospel emphasizes the connection between Jesus and the Old Testament. There's all sorts of quotations of the Hebrew scriptures throughout Matthew. Jesus is the continuation and fulfillment of God's promises to the Hebrew people. Chapters 1 through 3 of Matthew starts with a genealogy. It traces it from Abraham all the way to David, and then all the way to the Babylonian captivity, and then all the way to Jesus. So, right at the center of all of that is David. Uh, so it's like he's showing, Jesus is the Messiah from David's line. It shows 12 generations from Abraham to David, 12 generations from David to the exile in Babylon, and 12 generations from the exile to Jesus. And interestingly, the word David in Hebrew, it's essentially DVD because they don't use vowels. Those letters, when you assign numbers to them, add up to 12. 12, 12, 12. It's like the whole genealogy is shouting, Jesus is the Messiah from David's line. You've got your king back. Matthew also points out how Jesus is like a new and better Moses. So chapters 4 through 7 talk about how Jesus announces God's kingdom and rescue operation for the world. He gives his Sermon on the Mount, which highlights the upside down kingdom that Jesus came to bring, how he confronted evil and began restoring God's reign and creating a new family. And then in chapters 8 through 10, we hear stories of Jesus bringing God's kingdom into people's lives, that he's here to transform our hearts and our world, and he calls us to follow him. Jesus fulfills all of God's promises spoken through the prophets. He was born in Bethlehem, which was King David's hometown. He was visited by wise men from the east. He was born to a virgin, and he gave his life for us, just as Isaiah and many of the other prophets promised. Jesus is Emmanuel, God with us. In chapter 10, we read about how Jesus sent out the 12 disciples and told them to expect both acceptance and rejection from people, that their message would sometimes be received with joy and other times resisted. And then in chapters 11 to 13, Jesus experiences that himself. People have all these different reactions to Jesus. Some are positive, some are neutral, and some are negative, especially from the religious leaders who tried to kill Jesus. In chapter 13, we hear a whole bunch of parables from Jesus about what God's surprising kingdom is like. In the link of this, in the description of this video, I'm going to give you links to not only the LCMC Gathering website, but also the Bible Project's guide with 2 videos on Matthew. I encourage you to watch the first video that goes up to chapter 13. It shows how this gospel is beautifully crafted to highlight particular truths about Jesus. Then we'll watch the second video in a few weeks that will walk through the rest of the story of Matthew as we read through it. I'm also going to give you an article on Jesus's baptism, which gives a picture of being rescued through the waters of death to enter new creation life. Baptism connects to all sorts of stories in the Old Testament: Noah's Ark, Moses and the Red Sea, Joshua and the Promised Land, and even the story of creation, because baptism is us being ushered into God's new creation, which we see fulfilled at the end of the Bible, the book of Revelation. I hope you have a wonderful rest of the week. See you on Sunday for worship at 8:30 or 11, with Sunday school and adult class at 9:45. Enjoy the beautiful weather.